All right, we should be live at this point. Today is May 12th, 2018. All right, so today's subject is going to be God consciousness versus society consciousness. And we're going to begin this discussion by reading from, let me get that in the picture here. Yeah. We're going to begin today's conversation by first reading from the book Sri Guru and His Grace by Srila Sridhara Maharaj. This book was, I believe, first published in 1980 something, 81, 82, something like
83,
that.
1983.
1983, all right. And this book is certainly a very, very important book for devotees at all stages of Krishna consciousness in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So, Goswami, I'll request you to read. We're going to read a few of the paragraphs, then possibly comment, and also Giri Maharaj has a few quotations from Bhaktivinoda Thakura and from Srila Bhakti-yoga, and I believe from Srila Prabhupada, also regarding this topic of society consciousness, God consciousness, etc. So, Goswami, if you'll just go ahead and start the reading, and we'll take it from there, all right?
Hare Krishna. This is from the chapter God Consciousness versus Society Consciousness. And the question is posed by a devotee. In the quest for spiritual truth, one may join a religious mission to advance towards the ultimate goal of life. After some time, however, sectarian policies may appear to bar the path of progress. He may see that within the society, pragmatic concerns take precedence over spiritual ideals. If one feels the necessity to look elsewhere, his authorities may tell him there are no higher truths to be found. One may also be warned that if he leaves the society, he will suffer serious repercussions. He may become an outcast, branded as a heretic, for pursuing what he sincerely feels to be the ideal upon which the society was founded. Should he risk leaving the society, ignoring the advice of his immediate authorities, or should he try to remain within that society? Srila Sridhara Maharaj responds, progress means elimination and new acceptance. So, when there is a clash between the relative and the absolute standpoint, the relative must be left aside, and the absolute should be accepted. Suppose you are an American, but at heart, you are a socialist. In your general practices, you will live harmoniously as an American. But when there is a conflict between the capitalists and the socialists, which side will you accept? Socialist or capitalist? Your creed is that of a socialist. You live in a country where the majority are capitalists. When there is no difference between the two parties, there's no conflict. But when there is a clash, which side will you side with? Internally, you may identify yourself as a socialist, but for the sake of peace and for the good of the country, you may not express it externally. But suppose you are an out-and-out socialist. You will try to keep your creed, the purity of your faith, for the socialists. You will try to leave the country and join the socialists. So the absolute and the relative are two different classes of interest, and we find more importance in the absolute interest. We must be sincere to our own creed. Sometimes we have to leave our paraphernalia if it does not suit us. So also, even in the conception of purity of the Krishna consciousness movement, in the Vaishnava creed, there is purity in form. The form is necessary to help me in a general way, to maintain my present position. At the same time, my conception of the higher ideal will always goad me to advance, to go forward. And wherever I go, I must follow the greater model, the greater ideal. Spiritual life is progressive, not stagnant. Do you follow? Devotee, yes.
Okay, well, as I mentioned before we started, we find ourselves again dealing with relative and absolute. This time in relation to, I guess, what could be properly described as an organized efforts to spread Krishna consciousness in the world, organized efforts to spread the Sankirtan movement. So I think there's something here I wanted to read. I don't know really in which order should we. We can't read all this. I was going to skip ahead and read a portion, but maybe I think I'll let Giri, you read what the couple things you have there from Bhaktivinoda, Saraswati Thakur, Prabhupada about society consciousness, things like this. And then I'm going to try to piece all this together in a coherent conversation so that it all becomes very relevant, not only to the time that this was spoken by Srila Sridhara Maharaj back in the early 1980s, but it remains very relevant even in our present time, 2018, many years later. So just don't jump from one to the other real quick. Just pause for a minute in case anything needs to be said. But to probably start with the one by Bhaktivinoda Thakura in the Bhagavad, all right?
Yeah.
Now, what you might do, don't read it just that part of the quote, like kind of go a few sentences above so it's kind of seen in its entirety.
Sure. Well, it starts on its own, this part. It's a beginning of a paragraph. He starts with by talking about this.
Okay, and go ahead and mention about this is originally in English, not in Bengali, so this is not a matter of translation or mistranslation.
No, this was an English lecture he gave in Dinajpur in 1869.
Ooh, 1869.
Yeah, way back.
That's back there.
Yeah. So he says, party spirit, that great enemy of truth, will always baffle the attempt of the inquirer who tries to gather truth from religious works of his nation, and will make him believe that absolute truth is nowhere except in his old religious books. That's what Bhaktivinoda Thakura says about party spirit.
Where is that statement, the great enemy of self-realization? Is that there, or is that just a way...
Spirit, the great enemy of truth, he calls it.
Okay, the great enemy of truth, yeah. That sometimes gets then misquoted in general conversation as being the enemy of self-realization. So, synonymous, the enemy of truth. All right.
Yeah.
So, any other further quotes there?
There's a further quote by Bhakti-yoga, in an English article that he wrote back in 1932 in the Harmonist magazine. And it was an article called Putana. It was explaining what the Putana demoness represents.
Which is?
I think Putana is false guru.
False guru.
That's the false guru. So, Srila Thakur says, the idea of organized church in an intelligible form indeed marks the close of the living spiritual movement.
Oof.
The great ecclesiastical establishments are the dikes and the dams to retain the current that cannot be held by any such contrivances. They indeed indicate a desire on the part of the masses to exploit a spiritual movement for their own purpose. They also unmistakably indicate the end of the absolute and unconventional guidance of the bona fide spiritual master.
Ooh. Ouch! That's a tough one. That has to be a tough one because Srila Bhakti-yoga himself established the Gaudiya Mutt with a structure,
right,
with a practice, with a methodology, numerous methodologies in preaching, and certainly it must be said that it is a church. In fact, when he built the Adbhut Mandir at Mayapur, at Yogapit, on the very birth site of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, it's it's just so obvious. It looks like a church steeple, and not in any way, looking like later Gaudiya Mutt temples, which were built more in the contemporary or not contemporary, but in the classical Bengali style of Bengal. I mean, that's so apparent in Srila Sridhara Maharaja's temple, and actually all the temples on Bhakti-yoga Road, pretty much.
Right.
But this, the temple at Mayapur, marking the very birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the original Adbhut Mandir, as envisioned by Bhaktivinoda, it looks like a church steeple. It's a four-sided, squared-off pyramidal, pyramid, kind of long, elongated pyramid, typical of many church spires. So I think it's been called before the Church of Sri Chaitanya. That was a preaching.
Yeah, Bhaktivinoda Thakura says that in Sri Chaitanya's Life and Precepts.
The Church
of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Yeah, so in order to make that presentable to the Western readers and the Western onlookers. Saraswati Thakur is saying such institutions, and he's just created one or established one, mark the end. They're like dams that try to, how exactly did he say?
He says they're like dams and dikes to retain the current that cannot be held by such contrivances.
So, how is one to understand this then? Well, the way I feel it should be read is this is a warning. Saraswati Thakur is giving a warning, not just to his, but foremost to his own disciples, who will at some stage take the helm of said institution for spreading the teachings of Lord Chaitanya in the world, across India and in the world. They will one day take the helm. So he's established this institution, but at the same time, he's established here, or is giving, not established, but is giving here a warning that such institutions, if they're not managed properly, they can become an obstacle to their very purpose, for the very purpose which they were created. So let me mention a couple things before this. Bhaktivinoda Thakura had done extensive preaching, but he did not establish any said institution as we know the Gaudiya Mutt to have been an institution and still is an institution. It just passed a few years back its 100 years anniversary. And it was a big event in India, particularly in Bengal, and the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, came and spoke extensively, glorifying the Gaudiya Mutt, glorifying the work of Srila Bhakti-yoga, and all those who have carried that work forward in India and around the world. It was a huge event. It was like over 50,000 people had gathered for the event in a big stadium. I believe it was in a
cricket stadium. Yeah.
Yeah, big cricket stadium there in Calcutta. So they've endured now for 100 years. But Bhaktivinoda Thakura had not established any such institution, what we would recognize as an institution today. And I might add, before that, and so before that means let's look back approximately 400 years to the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, roughly 400 years. There were no institutions as we know institutions today, unless one wants to say, oh, actually, Lord Nityananda established the Vishwa Vaishnava Raj Sabha. Is that correct, Gary?
Jiva Goswami, I think, started.
Yeah, Nityananda. Yeah. Jiva Goswami established the Vishwa Vaishnava Raj Sabha. And what it was a gathering which would be held from time to time. I don't know how often, but it was a group of senior Vaishnavas who were to make sure that the philosophy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was not getting diluted or distorted by any outside influences, any Upa-siddhantas or deviations or anything of that matter. That's what it was for. It was actually an organization to preserve the teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. All right, so, well, then comes the modern era in India, and that's post-Mughal era in India, and that is known as the British Raj in India. And the British, being true to being British, are were, still are, and they are the ones who introduced this modern conception of institutions. Now, some people have even made the observation or the criticism that Srila Bhakti-siddhanta modeled his institution after the Ramakrishna mission. Well, I think by date, what people know as the Ramakrishna mission was set up under British rules, regulations, what they called them, Society Acts, ACTX, they had their way. And then after, sometime later, the Gaudiya Math was established. And if we go and look at the records, there were many institutions set up by different groups, religions, everything in India, political, non-political, and these were all following then these rules and regulations, which were more or less copied from the British, and they were each of these would then state its purposes in its what do you call bylaws and
they have a statement of purpose,
statement of purpose, and things like that. So we don't think that, then Bhaktisiddhanta just got a Xerox copy of the Ramakrishna mission and duped it. But the similarity is definitely there because they follow the British rules and regulations for such things. All right, so since then, we go forward, we'll find I believe it was 1953, our Srila Prabhupada established the League of Devotees, registered that, published his pamphlet also. So that's very interesting. These are institutions in the modern sense. But before Bhaktisiddhanta, there were no such institutions as we know them today for the propagation of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Okay, so nowadays you have many institutions. Not that there's just Gaudiya Math, and then of course 1965 or 66. It was actually 1966. The International Society was International Society for Krishna Consciousness was established by Srila Prabhupada in New York City. And this became a very, 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 very prominent institution, particularly in the Western world, but not exclusively Western. It was also and remains very prominent in India today, inspiring all those around. And from that, other institutions have developed. There's the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava Society, and there's Vrinda, and there are many branches of Gaudiya Math also. But originally there was just one Gaudiya Math established by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. But one thing I want to mention is that before these modern institutions were established, there were the ancient institutions, and the ancient institutions were not societies. They were not societal, and they were not societal conscious in any way. And what I'm speaking about is the sampradaya, the parampara, the sampradaya. So the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava Sampradaya in Bengal had been existing since the time of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Mahaprabhu's guru, Ishwar Puri, Ishwar's guru, Madhavinda Puri, was initiated in the Madhva Sampradaya. Giri, can you recall which Astamat at this time? Which Astamat?
Maybe Uttaradi. I think it's Uttaradi Mat.
Wasn't it the one with the horse?
That's Oh, I can't remember that name of that mutt.
Oh.
But no, I think we're that connection was Uttaradi mutt, I believe.
All right, so we'll go with that for right now. That Madhavendra Puri was initiated in the Uttaradi mutt of the Madhva Sampradaya, and thus we have the Gaudiya, the Brahma Madhva. Gaudiya means in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu up to the present day. Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya. So the Sampradaya is what everyone belonged to. When Jiva Goswami brought the senior Vaishnavas together, the Gaudiyas together to preserve the teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they may have been from, at that time, say in Vrindavan, different temples, without being exactly specific, but there's Govindaji, Rupa Goswami's temple, Jiva Goswami's own temple, Radha Damodar, there's Shamananda Prabhu just across the garden, up the footpath, Shamananda Goswami. There's Madan Mohan temple, this is their Sanatan Goswami, and their descendants. So he brings them all together. They're from different temples, but they don't have different societies. They belong to one singular sampradaya, which now we know as the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya. So, after the time of by the time of Bhaktivinoda Thakura, the sampradaya of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas in the line of Sri Jiva and Sri Rupa it had all but disappeared. Disappeared in the sense that it wasn't gone, it wasn't extinct, it wasn't broken, but it wasn't visible either. It was very much just tucked away and hidden. And so Bhaktivinoda began to propagate that line, the line of Sri Rupa, and he coined the term Rupanugas, that we are followers of Sri Rupa Goswami. But he didn't make a modern institution. Bhakti-siddhanta did that. And since Bhakti-siddhanta, we find there are many institutions. I think everyone can see, what I'm saying is correct. Nowadays there are many institutions of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Well, considering the bona fides, I'm talking about from a bona fide point of view, all these institutions, at least the ones I have in mind, they bear one thing in common, and that is they're members of the same sampradaya. So now we look at absolute and relative for a minute. The sampradaya is an absolute consideration. It is not a society. It is a parampara. It is guru-disciple of the bona fide type. Continuum means going on. It is not a relative thing. That is an absolute thing. Whereas the societies that appear along the way, starting in modern times with the Gaudiya Vaishnava Society, Gaudiya Vaishnava Society, with the Gaudiya Mutt, and up to the present day of all the different societies that exist, these societies are relative. They're not absolute. They may be created by a prominent acharya, or they may be created by the disciple of a prominent acharya. But in either case, they're relative, not absolute. Well, some people say, oh, wait a minute, here we go again. What are you doing? What are you saying? Prabhupada said, ISKCON is my body. Prabhupada is absolute. Therefore, his institution is absolute. But these same people will not say that Gaudiya Mutt is absolute, you see. And if Prabhupada is absolute, remember the last talk we had, then Bhakti-siddhanta is absolute. And if ISKCON is Prabhupada's body, well, then Gaudiya Mutt is the body of Bhakti-siddhanta. But let us all remember, Bhakti-siddhanta said, and Prabhupada said over and over again, I am not this body. So ISKCON may have been his body or is his body, but he's not the body. All right, so and before this he had the League of Devotees, and he certainly wasn't thinking. I think it's safe to say Prabhupada wasn't thinking, well, I'm going to put all my time and energy into this, but I'm just going to let it slide later and trash it because I'm going to establish something different a few years down the line. a few years from now in New York City in the United States of America. I don't think so. He was giving the League of Devotees his all in all for the time. Okay? So these creation societies are relative, but the sampradaya that we all belong to, that is absolute. Now, I think Srila Maharaja is going to make that very clear, and I want to say at this time, we can't discuss all these things. Already people have said, oh, these talks are too long, nobody has time. Well, to understand the truth, you're going to have to spend the time. And if you want to understand the relative and absolute nature of societies and sampradaya and all this stuff, then this is a book you want to read. And you want to read it more than once. I've read it at least 50 times. I stopped counting. But you want to read this, Sri Guru and His Grace. All right, so now...
There's this one I wanted to mention, Guru Maharaj.
Please.
In relation to the relativity of societies, back in 1994, when you were doing the Gaudiya magazine, we received a letter from Achyutananda Prabhu. And it's very relevant to what you're saying. It's a very short thing. He said, regarding sects...
Who said?
Achyutananda.
Oh, and I put this in an article.
It was never put in an article. This wasn't put in an article.
Oh, okay.
But he said, I was present at 26 Second Avenue when Srila Prabhupada received the documents that certified ISKCON as a registered tax-exempt society. We are not attached to any organization, he said. It is an instrument we will use, and if it becomes troublesome, we will dissolve it and go on chanting Hare Krishna.
Yes, I remember now when he sent us that letter. That was Achyutananda Prabhu who sent us that letter. And what is he speaking from there? Is he speaking prophetically? No. He's speaking historically. He's speaking that he himself was a part of a great institution, the institution set up by his spiritual master. But at a time, something went wrong. And what did he do? He did exactly what he said you may have to do in the future. And that is move on, following the absolute, leaving the relative aside. Now, some people, devotees, may be under the impression that, no, or what do you mean, or there was only Prabhupada. I mean, I know a lot of people that they think Bhakti-siddhanta is basically having one disciple that he said anything favorably about, or one disciple who actually achieved the perfection. And most devotees don't even look and think of Srila Prabhupada as achieving anything. They say he was born perfect, you see, born a pure devotee. So that's not something I want to discuss right now, but most people they're not conscious that Srila Bhakti-siddhanta had more than one successful devotee. So I think, go ahead and, I mean, there were a number of them there. I don't think we put together all those quotes, but there were quotes about Keshav Maharaj. Right. There were quotes about Srila Sridhara Maharaj. There were quotes about Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj being Paramahansa. Different things like this. So read that one quote that we have. I think it's from Srila Prabhupada's books where he's referring to there are many or other societies of pure devotion.
That's chapter 19 in Nectar Devotion.
Chapter 19.
Yeah. He says, there are many societies and associations of pure devotees. And if someone with just a little faith begins to associate with such societies, his advancement to pure devotional service is rapid.
So I wonder who he's speaking about there. There are others. Who are those others? Do you think he's speaking about the Ramanujas or maybe the Madhvas? Could be. They're bona fide parampara, but they're not followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. In fact, on occasion, I've called the Madhvas atheists. And I've called them that in black and white print. And some devotees have said, oh, what are you talking about? That's an offense. I said, well, I'm not calling Madhvacharya an atheist. But I am calling certain Mudvites, what we call the Mudvites, atheists, because they don't accept Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Mahaprabhu is Krishna himself. Krishna is God. What do you call somebody who doesn't accept God? That's an atheist. So when they remain to themselves and remain in their own space, yes, they're Vaishnava. But when they step out of that space and criticize Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and criticize his parampara and say that Mahaprabhu is just an ordinary man, then I call them an atheist because they don't believe, they're not accepting Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Bhaktivinoda wrote a book that really pissed off the Mudvites, and that is when he wrote a book. Gary, you'll have to refresh me which book it is, and he tells that Mahaprabhu met Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that Madhvacharya met Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
He had a dream of Mahaprabhu. Yeah.
Yes, he met him in a dream, and Mahaprabhu instructed him what to preach and what not to preach. And the Madhva Sampradaya become very, very upset with this and wanted that. What?
He asked us to retract that statement from Bhaktivinoda Thakura.
Yeah, retract that statement. Change the books. Ooh, change the books. That topic's coming, folks. Change the books. All right, so Srila Prabhupada is mentioning that there are societies. He also, and in one similar quote, or was it this one you just read, he said, such as our International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
Yeah, that's in Bhagavatam, 3rd canto. He says, if the same principles can be adopted here, wholly or partially, then it is also Vaikuntha. So it is with any society, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
So one might think that Srila Prabhupada had an exclusive way of looking at his creation, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, as being the only vehicle for Krishna consciousness in the world. And that is certainly not true. Neither did he did not consider it the only vehicle. He recognized that there were other vehicles, but he recognizes what's important is the principles of Krishna consciousness. Now, I remember many, many years ago, about 20-some years ago or more, you asked us, one senior member of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, about 24 years ago or something, you asked them, what is the position of Narasingha Maharaj and those devotees, disciples of Prabhupada in South India who are not in ISKCON, and you were told that we would have to take our birth in ISKCON in the next life, excuse me, in order to go back to Godhead. Well, that's very Mudvite too, you know.
Very Catholic.
Very Catholic. That's very Catholic. No Protestants in the spiritual world. They believe in Jesus, but no Protestants up there in heaven. Only Catholics. And the Madhvas say that, yes, it's very nice what ISKCON has done, what Swami Prabhupada has done, and all these things. But you see, you have to be born as a Hindu in Udupi district in order to
Not just Hindu, a Brahmin.
Oh, yes, right.
Brahmin
you have to
Udupi.
be born in a Brahmin in Madhva Sampradaya in the Udupi district in order to achieve the perfection. So we kind of laugh at this, but not just laugh at it. There's much Shastra, Vedic, Puranic to prove this is not anywhere even close to the truth. This is society consciousness happening even inside a Sampradaya. You see, what to speak of a relative organization, which is just some registered piece of paper somewhere. But again, I think sometimes devotees are thrown for a loop there when Srila Prabhupada says, yes, we will have our ISKCON in the spiritual world. That's a relative statement. That's not absolute. Unless you take that verse of Das Goswami that we read a couple videos ago, a few days ago, the Namashreshtam verse, which is the highest ideal of Guru Tattva, and which Sridhara Maharaj thought was the highest ideal of Srila Prabhupada's creation in the form of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So some of them, people say, well, and then if somebody wants to say, well, then they're relativizing, aren't they? They're going to the relative side. Some of the same people who say no, Prabhupada is absolute, when you point out some of the things he said, they go, well, and then they want to pull the relative card, Well, he didn't really mean that, or, well, he was just being gracious, and they want to pull the relative card. Okay, so we call that supermarket shopping, accept, reject, all these things, but with another motive in mind. So, but this does bring to mind the fact that one day one of Srila Prabhupada's disciples wrote Prabhupada a letter and requested if he could take second initiation. He had first initiation. His name, I believe, was Asita. And I don't know what country he was from. It might have been England. I'm not sure. But he was in India for some time. And
I think he was Indian.
Indian? Asita?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
I think I met Asita. Anyway, maybe someone can clarify that for us. But this Asita wrote a letter to Srila Prabhupada and asked if he could take second initiation from Bhakti Madhav Maharaj, who was godbrother of Srila Prabhupada. So I asked you if you could find that in the folio.
Yeah.
Were you able to find that this morning?
Yeah, there were 3 letters. Yeah.
There were several letters in that regard. I don't think do we have the letter to Srila Prabhupada? No.
No, that we don't have.
That is there in the archives, but it's not included in the folio. Okay, but we have Srila Prabhupada's reply to Asita, who's requesting initiation. Then there's a letter to Sripad Madhav Maharaj, and then there is a letter, I believe, to Jayapataka Maharaj.
Yeah.
And these letters are dated, correct? And
yes.
As I remember, this 3-letter correspondence is very important, and it gets really important when you see the dates on which letter was written which. So what is the first letter that...
The first letter is Asita.
Okay, so read us what's important about that letter.
Okay. Prabhupada says, I'm in due receipt of your letter, dated nil, and noted the contents.
Okay, what's the date he's writing this letter?
This is 10th of January, 1975.
10th January. Okay, that's important. So Asita didn't date his letter, but it's written a few days before, right? All right. Go ahead.
If you want to stay there, I have no objection. For the time being, you can perform your devotional service in Puri, and when I return to Mayapur in mid-March, you can see me, and we shall see what was the cause of your being asked to leave. It is a big establishment, and sometimes disagreement happens, and I am helpless. I'm inquiring from Mayapur why you were asked to leave there. If you want to take initiation from Madhav Goswami Maharaj, I have no objection.
Wow.
So that's the first letter.
All right. Then the next letter?
The next letter, same date, 10th of January 1975, is to Jayapataka Maharaj.
Okay.
So Prabhupada writes, I have just received one letter from Asita Das, wherein he claims that he was all of a sudden asked to go away from Mayapur. What was the situation? Kindly let me know. That's it.
Same day.
Same day.
All right. Then the third letter?
This comes 4 days later, 14th of January, to Madhav Maharaj.
All right.
So Prabhupada writes, please accept my humble obeisances at your lotus feet. I understand from the letter of Asita Das that he has gone to your place in Jagannath Puri. He has asked permission from me for taking initiation from you. I have given him my permission, and you can initiate him, if you like, so that he may increase his devotional service there.
All right. This is a very unique circumstance. So I don't know that much about why Asita had left Mayapur, or why he was asked to leave, and very well may have been for some significant and good reason. But I think what we need to note here is that if this happened today to somebody else, for example, a guru in the world today received a letter from someone like Asita stating the exact same thing, what would probably happen is, well, he'd make a phone call or a WhatsApp or send an email to Mayapur and inquire why this person was pushed out. He would make inquiry about that first, you see, before he would give permission and acquiesce? No. Just give permission to the request. But what we find here is Prabhupada doesn't know Asita and what's his situation, but he does know Sripad Madhav Maharaj. That's his god brother. And their history goes back, well, before any of us were even born. So, a prominent disciple of Srila Bhakti-yoga, god brother of Srila Prabhupada. So it appears that he doesn't hesitate. And he's telling Asita, if you want to take initiation from Madhav Maharaj, I have no objection. He's telling Madhav Maharaj, don't worry, if you want to give him initiation, I have no objection. Because Prabhupada knows, he knows, that Madhav Maharaj is one of those groups that he has just mentioned in this other, in his books and such, as being a bona fide society, a bona fide branch. He knows that Madhav Maharaj is in the parampara, and he knows that Madhav Maharaj can take this Asita, who was Prabhupada's disciple, back to Godhead. That's my understanding. Does that sound correct to either of you?
Yep.
Well, the fact that Prabhupada addresses, his obeisances to his lotus feet. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily say that to any god brother, right? It's a god brother of distinction. Yeah.
That's true. Srila Prabhupada did not have a lot of contact with a lot of different god brothers, but certainly Madhav Maharaj was one that he did, and he held in very high regard.
I did just look up Asita, and it's been mentioned here by a few people that Asita initially was inspired by Madhav Maharaj, but he took initiation from Srila Prabhupada.
Oh, okay.
And then his Shraddha appeared again for Madhav Maharaj, and that's why he was writing to Srila Prabhupada.
Very interesting. So I put in here, this isn't about, oh, he's my disciple, oh, I want this disciple, why did you initiate my disciple? This is not about I, me, and mine, and the disciple being ripped asunder in the middle. Mm-hmm. This is about the flow of Krishna, where faith appears, how faith appears. The agents of Krishna are not simply one, have never been only one, and thank God never will be only one. But that tendency is there, that there's only one guru, Ami Guru, Jagat Guru. There's only one institution. That's the one I belong to, you see. And when managerial issues come into play, finances, enough people to keep the show going, and all these things, then unfortunately, other things come out. So let's reflect back here to, let me see, let me read something here, and hopefully this will add to the conversation. This is from Srila Sridhara Maharaj. This is also from the book Sri Guru and His Grace, same chapter where Goswami was reading, just jumping ahead a couple paragraphs. So, yes. Okay, in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says, quote, "It is better to die while performing one's own duty than to try to do another's duty," end quote. That is one stage of understanding, the relative consideration. Sri Maharaj is saying that statement in Gita by Krishna is a relative consideration. The absolute consideration, he continues, the absolute consideration is also given in Bhagavad Gita. So here we go again, both relative and absolute. The absolute consideration is also given in Bhagavad Gita. Sarva dharman pariyaja mam ekam saranam braja. Krishna says, give up everything. Come to me directly. So in one place, he's telling Arjuna, stick to your duty, Arjuna. Don't try to do the duty of another. Then later he's telling him, you know what, Arjuna? Just give up all those duties and come to me. This is the revolutionary way. This is the absolute. This, the other, is the relative. Stick to your own clan. Stick to your own dharma. Don't leave them. Stay where you are. That is the national conception, the society conception. There is national consciousness and God consciousness, society consciousness and God consciousness. God consciousness is absolute. If society consciousness hinders the development of God consciousness, it should be left behind because it's relative. This is confirmed in Srimad Bhagavatam, 5th canto, 5th chapter, 18th verse, English translation, quote, even a spiritual master, a relative, parent, a husband, or demigod who cannot save us from repeated birth and death should be abandoned at once. End of quote. From Srimad Bhagavatam. Sridhara Maharaj continues, what to speak of ordinary things? Even the guru may have to be abandoned. One may even have to give up one's own spiritual guide. Refer back to a couple days ago, Bipin Bihari Goswami, Diksha Guru of Bhaktivinoda Thakura. He is later abandoned, making Bipin Bihari a Param Guru of Bhakti-yoga. And Bhakti-yoga completely leaves him aside. And Sridhar Maharaj says, as in the case of Bali Maharaj, or in the case of one's relatives, as in the case of Bibhishana. In the case of Prahlad, his father had to be given up. And in the case of Bharat Maharaj, it was his mother. In the case of Katvanga Maharaj, he left the demigods. And in the case of the Yagnapatnis, the wives of the Brahmanas, they left their husbands in the endeavor to reach the absolute personality. Sridhar Maharaj continues, we need society only to help us. If our affinity to the society keeps us down, then that should be given up, and we must march on. There is the absolute consideration and the relative consideration. When they come into clash, the relative must be given up, and the absolute should be accepted. So again, remembering the life's journey of Srila Prabhupada, he had to do that very thing. There's no question of minimizing the creation of Bhakti-siddhanta as something less than Srila Prabhupada's later creation of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Both were meant as vehicles for spreading the absolute truth. But when the Gaudiya Mutt became fractured, broken, then Srila Prabhupada embarked, leaving the relative aside, and took the order of his spiritual master, what he understood to be the instruction of his spiritual master, and he marched forward. So we have a quote about that, Giri, I believe, and it's from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, a rather lengthy one about those who became asar, those who became useless, the fighting, those who did not obey the spiritual master, and this is in Srila Prabhupada's books, or at least it was the last time I looked. Is it?
It's still there.
Oh, this will still be there for sure, because anything that cuts asunder somebody else or another group or something like that, anything that cuts asunder his godbrothers, they're going to leave that there for sure. Yeah. But go ahead and read that, because it's important.
Sure. This is the purport to Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Leela 12.8. Prabhupada writes, in the beginning, during the presence of Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, all the disciples worked in agreement. But just after his disappearance, they disagreed. One party strictly followed the instructions of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, but another group created their own concoction about executing his desires. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, at the time of his departure, requested all his disciples to form a governing body and conduct missionary activities cooperatively. He did not instruct a particular man to become the next Acharya. But just after his passing away, his leading secretaries made plans, without authority, to occupy the post of Acharya, and they split in two factions over who the next Acharya would be. Consequently, both factions were asara, or useless, because they had no authority, having disobeyed the order of the spiritual master. Despite the spiritual master's order to form a governing body and execute the missionary activities of the Gaudiya Math, the two unauthorized factions began litigation that is still going on after 40 years with no decision.
Now, what is usually focused upon here is they didn't follow Bhakti-siddhanta's instruction. They went to the courts, litigation, and they became asar, useless. So what most people, because of not being attentive, they just assume this means everybody. This means everybody in Gaudiya Math. But in this very statement, you have to back up and read it slowly. Mm-hmm. Prabhupada is saying, first, there was one group who followed the instruction of Bhakti-siddhanta. Then there was another group.
Yeah.
And this other group then argued over who will be the Acharya, split into two, went into the courts, litigation, and both of them became asara, useless. Nobody ever asked, who's the group that followed?
Right.
Well, let me give you a couple of those names. Srila Sridhara Maharaj, Srila Madhav Maharaj, Srila Keshav Maharaj, Srila Yajavar Maharaj, our Srila Prabhupada, Srila Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj,
Damodar
Maharaj, and others. These gentlemen, these godbrothers of Srila Prabhupada, they are in group number 1, which followed. Now, an interesting thing to note, it's not just Srila Prabhupada that followed, and he was with that group. And you can read Satsarup Maharaj's biography, and at least you will get a little bit of information there, how Prabhupada preached with, associated with these people. And actually, it is this group of devotees that in 1943 gave our Srila Prabhupada the title Bhakti-vedanta. Prior to being known as Bhakti-siddhanta, he had been given the title Bhakti-siddhanta. Yes. On the League of Devotees registration papers, it also includes Prabhupada's signature as A.C. Bhakti-siddhanta Das Adhikari as an alias. There was a period of time when he was given this title. He was a Bhaicharan Day. Abhaicharan Aravinda. That was his Abhaicharan Day, his birth name. Then it was kind of transformed Abhaicharan Aravinda. And then Srila Prabhupada had been writing articles for the Bengali publication of Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj, and Goswami Maharaj and the other Vaishnavas were so impressed with our Srila Prabhupada and his preaching, and seeing him as a stalwart disciple of Bhakti-siddhanta, both as in his Grihastha Leela and later on in his Vanaprastha Leela. But so in 1943, he's given the title Bhakti-siddhanta Das. He becomes a Bhakti-siddhanta Das, A.C. Bhakti-siddhanta Das. Well, in that same group later, this was given to him by Saranga Maharaj. Then that group of devotees and godbrothers, they felt that, well, this is the name of their own guru, Bhakti-siddhanta, and the tradition was that Bhakti-siddhanta had never given the name Bhaktivinoda to anyone. And so in that light, they decided that we need to give some adjustment to this name Bhakti-siddhanta Das. And so at that time, Sridhar Maharaj, he suggested the title, the name, it's not a name, it's a title, Bhakti-vedanta. because Bhakti-siddhanta, the Siddhanta, and the Vedanta, the Bhakti-siddhanta, the Bhakti-vedanta, these are synonymous in their meaning, but they are different in their sound. And so everybody in the group, Srila Prabhupada, Saranga Maharaj, who had given him that title, Bhakti-siddhanta, everyone agreed with Sridhar Maharaj's suggestion, and Srila Prabhupada then became known as Bhakti-vedanta Prabhu. And in that meeting, Keshav Maharaj was so impressed, apparently, because he was part of that. He was so impressed of not just the name, but how this was seen to be coming from Bhakti-siddhanta. This recognition was coming to our Srila Prabhupada from Bhakti-siddhanta, but the flow was through Saranga Maharaj, Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj. And then Sridhar Maharaj adjusted that, brought that more into focus, you could say, and suggested the name Bhakti-vedanta. And, of course, history says, history screams that Srila Prabhupada was very happy with all these turns of events. And then he then modeled himself, you could sort of say, or profiled himself as the giver of the Bhakti-vedanta purports. And that became his name, title, and it stuck for his life. And this is all before...
Keshav Maharaj took that name and gave it all his sannyas disciples.
That's what I'm saying. Keshav Maharaj was obviously so impressed that this name has come down from Bhakti-siddhanta ultimately, and it has come through Saranga Maharaj and through Sridhar Maharaj, and Keshav Maharaj had tremendous love and respect for both of these godbrothers of his, that then henceforward Keshav Maharaj named all of his sannyasis as Bhakti-vedantas. And when Prabhupada did take sannyas many years later in 1959, Keshav Maharaj had already given that title to others, as Bhaktivedanta Narayan Maharaj, and that title continues today in the Devananda Gaudiya Mutt. Everyone becomes a Bhaktivedanta. But it starts with Prabhupada first getting this name, and he's not even Vanaprastha at the time. He gets this name. He's not even a Vanaprastha yet. It's 1943. And he gets this name, Bhaktivedanta. And please, anybody out there, please excuse me if I've messed up a couple of the dates. I'm notorious for messing up dates. But the fact is, that's how he got the name. Keshav Maharaj, very, 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 very impressed, and continued to give his sannyas disciples that name. And when Prabhupada did take sannyas in 1959, there's this famous picture of Prabhupada standing, our Prabhupada standing next to Keshav Maharaj, who's seated in a chair, and next to him is Muni Maharaj, or better, Bhaktivedanta Muni Maharaj, one of Prabhupada's god brothers. So, you can see in the history of Bhakti-siddhanta's disciples and Bhakti-siddhanta that, one, the society is a relative consideration. What is the absolute consideration is the sampradaya, the parampara. And that's just not a picture related succession. There are two things that have to keep the sampradaya together, or they become upasampradaya or upaparampara. They become bogus, they become broken, they become disconnected. And that is, one, the siddhanta. I pointed this out. How many upasiddhantas does it take to make an upasampradaya? Well, a sampradaya doesn't really have any upasiddhantas, but there is some measure of tolerance there that one may have a misunderstanding and then get that corrected. But if it's not corrected, then it becomes a siddhanta of a particular group within a sampradaya, then it becomes an upasampradaya. Okay? It's not that it's just tolerated forever. So, and the other thing is their achar, behavior. So it is possible to keep a philosophy up on one's lips and speaking it out there on the microphone, but then not keeping up the proper behavior. So for the sampradaya to remain intact, both behavior, correct behavior, and correct siddhanta have to be in order. and they're intertwined. They're not separated. Practice what you preach. You cannot be a hypocrite and be a representative in the parampara. So Prabhupada knew this, although maybe he did, or not maybe, he didn't speak in terms of, oh, this is relative, this is absolute. He didn't speak in those things, in those terms, and say, well, this is a relative thing I'm saying, or this is absolute. This you cannot forget. This you could forget. But in his actions, it's clear that he understands the difference between relative and absolute. And the institutions that we have today are relative. They are, it has been said by some, a necessary evil. What does that mean? That means that, and he says, they are necessary. Preachers require these things, particularly in this age. It's written, I should have asked you to look that up. And Srila Prabhupada says that the institutions, they are required in order for a preacher to have a support system, to have vehicles to preach. So that is the importance. But none of these institutions have a monopoly over the sampradaya, over the siddhanta. In fact, many of these institutions, I've pointed out in the broader sense of being, they're all come from this, all the members are in the sampradaya, or at least most of them are, yet they have upasiddhantic understandings, like the one that, Lord Brahma became Lord Jesus Christ, or the upasiddhanta that the jiva falls from the spiritual world of Vaikuntha or Goloka. Of course, usually upasiddhantas are supported by a statement of some type from somewhere. However, there are contradictory statements. And when there are contradictory statements by a leading acharya, or apparent contradictory statements, then one must go to previous acharyas in the sampradaya, and must one go to previous scripture of that sampradaya and resolve the apparent contradiction. But nowadays, people don't want to do that because they have chained themselves to a particular society consciousness and refuse to accept previous acharyas and the writings of previous acharyas, and particularly on this jiva issue, which we're going to discuss at length in other videos. Like I said, it's not even a debate. It's so clearly defined by Bhaktivinoda Thakura and Jiva Goswami and Bhakti-yoga. It's not a debate. You will not find contradictory statements or things that you can, no. So, parampara, sampradaya, this is what is absolute, and this is what must be followed. And Srila Prabhupada had to leave the Gaudiya Mutt because of deviations and in the instruction of Srila Bhakti-siddhanta. So someone may also say, yes, but Prabhupada, yes, and he's the one, and Prabhupada established the GBC. Well, there's a little bit of backstory, and we're going to end here in a minute, but a little bit of the backstory to what Srila Prabhupada is saying is, well, they did form a GBC. They formed the ideas possibly before they formed a GBC, but they formed a GBC after Bhakti-siddhanta, and the GBC then appointed 2 acharyas. And the GBC is the ones who started the whole deviation. So some people would criticize today, I'm not saying this myself, but I've heard other people say it, that yes, Prabhupada established the GBC, and after Prabhupada, the GBC established 11 acharyas, not 2 acharyas like Gaudiya Mutt, but 11 acharyas, and divided everything into zones, and pretty much there begins the deviation, much like Gaudiya Mutt. They chose 2, we chose 11. The question is, did Prabhupada choose the 11? That's another thing. The Ritviks have plenty to say about that. But in any case, it's similar, even if it's not a Xerox layover, ditto, the same thing. And there certainly is this misunderstanding that the society is forever. No, I'm sorry, the society is not forever. In fact, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, in Colombia, is not the same International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, in the United States and India and everything, because the whole international society left the whole international society and took the name with them. You see? And the International Society for Krishna Consciousness in the United States had to re-register as something else in the country of Colombia. And there are, if you're entering Singapore and some guy in immigration sees your neck beads and asks you, are you ISKCON? And you say yes, you're on the next plane out of the country, because ISKCON is banned in Singapore. And in Malaysia also, or parts of Indonesia, I forget exactly which, and therefore they are registered as some other institution. But in substance, they are ISKCON, but on paper, they're not. So, I mean, it's not even worth arguing about, but these things are relative, the institution. What makes the institution substantial is the sampradaya within, and within the sampradaya there are two things, as I mentioned. There's the siddhanta, and there is the behavior, and the two run hand in hand. They are not contradictory. There's no room for hypocrites in the sampradaya. Not if we want to maintain the truth of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, nor is there room for allowing society consciousness to overrule Krishna consciousness. And I think I could get many people, many devotees, both first and second generation disciples of Srila Prabhupada, to say, yes, this is what's happened. In fact, the fifth regulative principle, we have been informed, I hope properly, but we have been informed, and you read me something from a resolution, Giri Maharaj, yesterday, that the fifth regulative principle in ISKCON is not to leave ISKCON.
Oh, I know that, but I never.
Okay, then it was somebody else. I had looked that up.
I know that for a fact, though. That is true.
Yeah, that one vows to follow the four regulative principles and to never leave ISKCON, fifth regulative principle. So there's going to be another talk one of these days about the five regulative principles, but unfortunately the fifth regulative principle is not to leave the society. The fifth regulative principle is mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam when the personality of Kali has nowhere to hide, because there is no illicit sex, intoxication, gambling, and meat eating in the kingdom of Maharaj Parikshit. He then begs for another place where he can reside, and he is given, you can reside wherever gold is hoarded, and gold means wealth. So the fifth regulative principle, there actually are five, not four. The fifth regulative principle in Krishna consciousness is not to hoard wealth. So there are five regulative principles, but the fifth one is not to stay in the society. This is then what? Well, this is society consciousness. So that makes it all convenient. Don't leave the society, the truth is here. But if the truth isn't there, what will people do? Will they stay? Well, we pointed out already, thousands have chose not to. So anyway, that's it for today. That's all I think I wanted to say, and we're going to excerpt parts of this so that it's a little more digestible and little shorter clips for devotees to watch and listen to. Goswami, Giri Maharaj, anything to add further today?
I'd like to mention one thing about Sri Guru and His Grace.
Please.
For any devotee, both God brother, not God brother, third, second generation devotees who are, listening or will listen in the future and are faced with this similar issue of the relative and absolute considerations of the society. And I just recall when I read this book, every time you pick it up, you remember the first time you read it. And I read it cover to cover, and it's just, in every chapter you find the answers you're looking for, in the solutions that are needed to, solve this dilemma. So I can't but help to encourage anybody to, you can download this on PDF on the internet. You don't even need the copy. So please read this book.
Yeah, that's now in its 5th edition is what this one recently said. And this is, there we go. This is this is the 5th edition, Sri Guru and His Grace. And this is published by Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mutt. That is the mother mutt, so to speak. That is the main ashram of Srila Sridhar Maharaj. And much to tell you about that also. And all right, so that's it for today. Thank you all for listening, and Swamis for tuning in here and contributing to this discussion of God consciousness versus society consciousness. All right, Hare Krishna.
Hari Bol.
Hari Bol.